This game was played during the Moscow Interzonal, and it was one of the more important games in the tournament in terms of the fight for the first place and for qualifying to the candidate matches. It was a bit of a sensation because in this game Geller managed to beat one of the biggest experts in the endgame, Ulf Andersson, and he managed to do this in the endgame. In this position, Black could transpose into the mainland Scheveningens with a6, or he could continue with something like bishop to d7, but instead he decided to go ahead with a system that involves a fair bit of exchanges in the center. Black has given up one of his two bishops, but this is not a very big problem, and in general all his pieces are well placed. He doesn't have any major pawn weaknesses, while White has to worry about the pawn on e4. And here Black usually continues with exchanging on d1, just trading off the queens immediately. The move he made turned out to be inaccurate. It may be a bit hard to understand the point of this move, g4. After all, Black can defend against the threat of g5 by playing pawn to h6, and it seems like including g4 and h6 is kind of weakening White's position. Now the pawn on g4 may be a weakness, but what this move does is that, well, it opens up an escape square for the king, so there's no worry about the back rank for the White king. But the other important thing is that White wants to play knight to d5 and then knight takes on e7, and then it's very important that, as we'll see in the game, after knight d5, knight e4, knight takes e7, knight takes e7, rook d7, Black doesn't have knight to f5. So when you have two bishops, it's often recommended to advance the pawns so that they would take away the outposts from the opponent's knights, and this is exactly what this move does, just trying to see a little bit ahead and trying to take away the f5 square from the black knights, and it's also creating a useful threat of g5, of course. This move is a mistake because now Black gives up the second bishop, and because the position is open, it becomes very difficult for Black to oppose White. White's two bishops and his active rooks. So instead it was better to simply trade on d5. This move attacks the knight on e7, but it also attacks the pawn on b7, and also if, say, Black plays something like rook f to e8 to guard the knight, then the pressure on f7 would also be quite important. So White not only has enough compensation for the pawn, he has a very big advantage here because all his pieces are very active. Usually if you have two bishops and you manage to get a passed pawn, it is considered to be a very serious advantage. Here White has two bishops, and not only he has a passed pawn, he actually has two passed pawns on the queen side, and given that the material is even and that the a7 pawn is pretty weak, all this is probably quite decisive in terms of White's advantage. With this move, white attacks the rook on b8 and also opens up the rook to attack the pawn on e5. And black here could play rook e8 and guard the pawn, but it really wouldn't change very much because white can still attack the pawn on a5 or something like bishop to b6, and black really has no way to guard all the loose pawns that he has. And also what's also really bad is that he has no way of stopping the white pawns from advancing. And even though he tries to get some of the material back, such as the pawn on a2, in the end white still has two very strong passed pawns on the queen side, and this decides the game pretty soon. White could have played pawn to c5 or taken on a5 or anything else, but with this move he makes sure that the knight doesn't come out via c3, that black doesn't have a chance to play a rook to d3 himself, and it's just really prepares to advance the c-pawn under nice circumstances, and black has very little counterplay, if any. With this move, white naturally wants to advance the pawn further and further, but he also creates the he also opens diagonal for the bishop from a7, so if black goes something like rook to c2, then the bishop would come to d4 and pin the knight on f6, while the pawn is still pretty much threatening to go ahead. So there's really no convenient way for black to stop the white pawn, and his pieces are very scattered throughout the board and not coordinating very well. So because of all that, he resigned. So this is a very smooth game by Geller against Andersson, who is very good at understanding the endgame, but he just couldn't find a convenient plan to oppose white's two bishops here, and a couple of inaccurate moves, and he was pretty much blown off the board in this endgame. Yeah, it's one of the games that show in the Sicilian defense, even though it's considered that white's chances are mostly in the middle game and in attacking opponent's king, there are also a lot of endgames that are very promising for white against the Sicilian defense, and that's one of those.